Howdy, Larken Rose here. Time for another daily rant. Now, a few people have been asking that I do a thing about anti-authoritarian parenting, which it's come up in a few different discussions here and there, but I've never actually made a video about it, in part because Stefan Molyneux has made 12 million podcasts and videos about it, which is a lot of really good stuff. But at people's request, I thought I'd talk a little bit about it. For starters, people love to say, well, if you don't have kids, you can't say anything about parenting. Which, first of all, isn't at all true. Because most of what I believe now, I already believed before Tessa and I had any children. We have one daughter now who's 17, which is terrifying. It's actually remarkably non-terrifying for us because we didn't try to put her in a cage. And to me, like, a lot of people think that if you're an anarchist and you don't believe in authority, it means you just let your baby stroll into the street or something, because otherwise you would be ruling them. No, it doesn't mean that. It depends what your underlying mentality is. And for centuries, the mentality has been, and I think this is slowly starting to change, the mentality has been that it's the job of the parents to mold the baby into being a person, as if they weren't going to be a person otherwise. They were going to be a vicious wild animal, and we have to make them into a proper upstanding citizen. And that's just totally backwards for so many reasons. They're already people. When a baby comes out, it's already a person. It's a person who can't do anything and doesn't know anything and can't take care of itself and can't make any choices based on anything because it understands exactly nothing. But it's already a person and it already owns itself. Now, it can't, much like somebody who's mentally retarded or in a coma even or whatever, if somebody does not have the mental faculties to take care of themselves, other people have to. And for example, if a retarded adult would walk into the street, it's perfectly good and righteous for somebody to physically stop them from walking into the street and getting themselves killed. There's a difference between that and saying, I am your rightful lord and master, I get to boss you around and make you do whatever I want. That's what authority is. Taking care of the baby so it doesn't, get itself killed or get itself all unhealthy or whatever is fundamentally different than saying, I am your master, you have an obligation to obey me, I have a right to rule you, and I'm going to make you into what you should be. And that's been the parenting attitude of most of the world throughout most of history, that the parents have to make the child into something of the parents' choosing, which is just twisted and weird. I know it's the norm. Well, it's becoming less and less the norm, but I realize it's kind of accepted. Oh, we have to make them into upstanding citizens, and that's not at all true. Now, there is an element of children imitate what they see. They behave the way they see other people behaving. Now, on the good side of that, the positive side, you can say we train them to be decent human beings who are considerate of others by being that ourselves. And they see us not being obnoxious jerks, and they see us helping other people and getting along and being polite and nice and all that. And they learn by example, not by you will do this or we hit you with a club, but they learn by imitation, because that's what kids do. They imitate whatever they see, especially from their parents. So if you want to call that training, I guess so, like being a good person so the little person sees big people being good people and decides to imitate them and be a good person too. Now, when they grow up to the point that their mental faculties can handle thinking about stuff and making choices, then it isn't just sort of reflex imitation anymore, it becomes part of them. They actually become good people. So in that sense, you could call it training, by showing, here's how to be a good person. But the downside of the fact that kids mimic what they see is that mostly what most kids see is authoritarian domination. And these days, it isn't usually by brute force like it was for most of the world through most of history, where if your kid doesn't do what you want, you beat the tar out of them until they do. But it's still sort of domineering, authoritarian command structure. That's what they see. And therefore, that's what they imitate. That's what they mimic. And so it was, there was that in my family. I was the youngest of, it seems like about 8,000 kids. It wasn't quite that many. I had 4 older brothers, and my parents were conservative. They weren't violent. They didn't beat the tar out of us, but they were conservative and authoritarian, and there were rules, and you have to do this and you have to do that. And naturally, the kids would mimic it. And so there became this hierarchy, the totem pole effect of, with me on the bottom, because I was the baby of the family, of they were being ruled and they wanted to rule somebody below them. And they were never like horribly sadistic or anything, but, like kids will be. They weren't, they were just kind of stupid and short-sighted. And now we all get along fine. It wasn't, I know there are lots of horror stories of just nasty torture and stuff. It wasn't that by any stretch of the imagination. But you can see how people who feel disempowered because they're being dominated want to turn around and dominate somebody else. And the extreme version of that you see in just blatant violent abuse, that kids who are just physically abused grow up to be physical abusers a lot of the time. And it's a cycle that goes over and over again. Well, the lesser version of that is people who are dominated and controlled by someone above them, or who pretends to be above them, want to turn around and do that to somebody else. And again, it's just kids mimicking what they see. And a sort of extreme example of mimicking what they see. Oh, I'll do the picnic analogy, because it's I think it's a really good and useful one, and it totally illustrates the difference between authoritarian parenting, which can look like it produced responsible, polite people, and actual parenting, as if you're raising a human being, not a robot, and how the outcome can look very similar, even though the real results, the fundamental, what the person actually is that you just raised, is fundamentally different. So here's my little analogy for that. You go to a picnic, and there are 2 families there nearby, and they each have some kids. And the whole time they both seem very well behaved, and the kids are polite and say please and thank you, and they're not all rambunctious and rowdy and disturbing other people and being obnoxious. They're having fun, but they're not being rude at everybody. And you think, oh, that's very nice. 2 nice families. What you don't know is that they're actually 2 very different styles of parenting. The first family told their children, you will do as we say or we hurt you. And when we're at this picnic, you will be polite and you will be quiet and you won't disturb people and you won't do this and do that, or you will be punished. And so they go to the picnic and they behave to avoid punishment. The other family was a bunch of freaking anarchists. And they didn't raise their kids to bow to them. They didn't say we have the right to rule you. They didn't say do these things or we hurt you. They said moral, decent human beings respect the self-ownership of everybody else. And if you don't want other people being rude to you and in your face and being obnoxious at you, don't do that to them, which is the golden rule, basically. So respect every other individual, and the fact that every other individual owns himself. And so don't do anything that messes with that. So those children grow up actually understanding why it's wrong. Not just they're afraid of being hurt if they do certain things, but they actually acknowledge the basis of morality, the non-aggression principle. Don't mess with other people. Don't be a pain in the neck for somebody else if they're not doing anything to you. And so the outcome, the symptom of both may be, hey, at this picnic, they were both really well behaved. And then the punchline of this little analogy thing is, however, this happened to be in Germany in the late 30s. And guess what happens a decade later when lots of people are saying, let's join the Nazi Party? The family that was raised authoritarian with commands and controls and hierarchy, those kids can't wait to be Nazis because it's what they've seen their whole lives. It's what they want. And now they get to be part of the thing that bosses other people around. Whereas the other family, the kids, if you tell them, hey, join this club and we can boss people around, they say, ew, that's wrong. We don't want to do that. So suddenly the symptoms are drastically different. The ones who were raised authoritarian will jump at the chance to violently dominate somebody else, which, by the way, happened in Germany. It also happened in the US and Soviet Union. And, it certainly was not, Germany wasn't even the most egregious example if you're going by body count. But it's been this way all over the world where cultures are raised authoritarian, and what looks like, because, the German culture before the Nazis took power was very authoritarian and was very sophisticated and advanced and polite and civilized. They weren't like wild animals in the street if you went to Germany before World War II. It was, wow, these people have technology, they're well-spoken, they're well-read, they're educated, all these good things. However, they're also very authoritarian, which means, if the wrong guy gets into a position where he convinces other people that he's authority, then you get nasty, horrible stuff happening. And that's true all over the world, and it's happened over and over again. That doesn't happen if the kids aren't trained to believe in authority. Like, pick any tyranny. We'll pick Mao in China. I mean, China is extremely authoritarian, hierarchy-based, so much so that names are the other way around from how they are in the Western world. You say the family name first. Like, your clan matters first, and then you state your individual name. Which, I don't know how pack mentality could be any more obvious than that. Is I am a member of this gang, and then I'm this individual. And so it's a very authoritarian culture. And then along comes Mao and says, oh, I have a great plan. I'm going to fix everything. And people go, yeah, he has a great plan. He's going to fix everything. And of course, it isn't by suggestion. It's by command. It's by authoritarian domination. And he says, here's what everybody has to do. And people go, rah, 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 because now authority is going to save the day. And then 40-some million people starve to death going along with his great plan, which wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. You have to do this, we're going to hurt you if you don't go along with our great and noble plan for the people, yada, yada, yada. And horrible, nasty, evil things happen. Well, imagine if there's a country with 1 billion anarchists in it, and Mao comes along, Mao gets resurrected and comes along and says, I have a great plan, put me in power. The anarchists say, no. I mean, if you have a plan, you can suggest it to us, and some of us might voluntarily participate, and as soon as he says his plan, it's forced down authoritarian control freakism, and they all go, no, we don't want that, no thanks. And that's why the nasty tyrants individually get blamed. Like, people point at Hitler. Hitler was so evil, and Stalin was so evil, and Mao was so evil, and Pol Pot, and go down the list. Yeah, they were evil, narcissistic, sociopathic psychos, but the only reason they were able to do any damage is because the children of those societies were taught to respect authority and do as they're told and obey commands. Because one evil psycho, without thousands or millions of people who will blindly obey him because they perceive him as government and authority, he can't do anything. What would Hitler have been on his own if no one viewed him as authority? And this is a thing that it's glaring obvious once you see it, but most people don't see it. They sort of think that, oh, somehow he was just so charismatic. Well, no. He was charismatic on top of an authoritarian culture which said that obedience is a virtue. And so it totally traces back to parenting. And in this country, you get lots of people who, for example, join the military. And what's the military? The military is an authoritarian hierarchy, and different branches are different. But like in the Marines, for example, they very specifically, intentionally try to bludgeon the individuality out of every single Marine and make them into an unthinking robot. You're part of this big machine, and that's all you are. You're not supposed to think, and it's It's just torture. It's just mental torture what they put Marines through to make them into obeyers, not thinkers, not individuals, not, moral human beings with a conscience, but just tools of the ruling class who will go and kill whoever they're told to go and kill. And that's what the training is for. They're very open about it. And so lots of people join up, rah, 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 I'm fighting for the good guy team. And then they go do evil stuff. Now, I've been amazed, and this has to do with the culture shifting away from authoritarianism. I've been amazed by how many combat vets I know, or veterans who didn't see combat, but some of each, who are now anarchists and have, contacted me, and we talk about stuff. And it's fascinating to me that anybody could ever go through that level of authoritarian indoctrination. Because, compared to your average authoritarian parenting, Marine boot camp is pretty damn harsh. And still some people go through that, and they become robots and tools of the machine, and still a lot of them are figuring out, this is bogus. This isn't, I signed up to be one of the good guys. I'm not one of the good guys. This is creepy and weird and evil. And that's happening more and more. And that is what has to happen. It doesn't, like, the idea that who's in charge is what matters is just a joke. If you have an authoritarian culture where the kids are raised to believe that obedience is a virtue, and they do as they're told, and they think they're evil if they disobey, because they've been trained to think they're evil if they disobey, that is how you set up a situation where you can have a dictator who takes power, who says, rah, 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 hooray for us. There's a cool, The Wave. I don't know how I just remembered that. I usually forget such things. There's a movie based on an actual experiment that was done. The movie is in German. I can't remember if the experiment was actually done in Germany or somewhere else. Where some teacher basically had this little club, and it was called The Wave, and if you do this, you're the in crowd, and you're cool. And I think his goal was basically to show how Nazi Germany can happen. And he accidentally did, and it got kind of more vicious than he had hoped. And there's a movie about it. That I'm not sure how exactly it represents it, but I think it's, it definitely gets the general thing across. And it demonstrates how creepy people get when they've been trained to believe in authority. Oh, another one, the Experiment. There's a German version and there's a English version, American version, whatever you want to call it. I highly recommend both of them, even though in theory they're the same plot. They're both very good. We watched them, Tessa and I watched them both almost back to back. I think it was on consecutive nights. And it's worth watching both of them, even though it's the same story. Different actors, different directors and everything, but the same general idea. And it's basically a continuation of the Stanford prison experiments. And in those experiments, a professor said, we're going to do a pretend prison just to kind of see what happens, studying human psychology. And some of the students are going to be guards and some are going to be inmates. And you'll do the role-playing thing. Now, there's not allowed to be any physical violence. You don't get to torture your prisoners and stuff like that. But we'll see how it goes. And they actually had to end the thing early because it was just this traumatic disaster where the guards turned into these sadistic, evil bastards. They couldn't, they weren't supposed to use outright violence, but they would just humiliate. They would sort of get into the role of authority. And what might be even creepier is that the ones who were playing the role of the prisoners got into that mentality, and they started to view themselves as deserving of it. And that's what authoritarian indoctrination does. It makes people think that they're deserving of being treated like subjects. And if you get that through somebody's head, I don't know a better way to mess with somebody's, view of reality than to convince them that they're supposed to be an underling who's being violently controlled. So anyway, the movie The Experiment, the German version and the American version, both sort of guess what would have happened if they didn't stop the Stanford prison experiments when they did, because they stopped it early because the guy in charge went, whoa, this is getting really creepy. Actually, as I understand it, his wife actually said, whoa, what the hell is going on with this experiment? This is creepy. And that's when he noticed, oh yeah, this is kind of creepy. Maybe I should stop it. So only then did he notice how demented things were getting. And this is in the U.S. And so it shows that it's not, the problem was not, Nazi Germany. The problem was not that there's something wrong with Germans. And the problem in the Soviet Union is not there's something wrong with Russians. Like, genetically, they're just evil for some reason. And the problem in China is not they're just genetically evil. The problem is when you have an authoritarian culture that raises children to think that obedience is a virtue and that disobedience is a sin, you set up a perfect scenario for a tyrant to get control and do evil crap with a lot of people who will obey him, even when they know they're doing the wrong thing. And that ties into the Milgram experiments too. The experiments by Stanley Milgram, which was a study in, to what extent will people do stuff they know is wrong just because a perceived authority told them to. And the only reason that happens is because people are raised by authoritarian parents who teach them that you're supposed to do what your elders or what those above you tell you to do. And the results in the Milgram experiments are really dang creepy. I highly recommend that people read Obedience to Authority, which is Milgram's book that goes through the results of his experiments that shows that, the culture that you create, including in the U.S., because, again, these experiments were done in the U.S., so we can't just blame it on Germany or blame it on Russia or something. Those other weird cultures are just somehow evil. This was in the U.S., and it was startling to note how the difference between what people who, and maybe in the next rant I'll actually get into the specifics of the experiment and as it relates to authoritarian parenting, but the people who were told about the experiment all predicted, oh, the outcome is going to be this. And it was nowhere near what the actual outcome was. The actual outcome was way worse. And the punchline of that, again, I'll get into more details later. The thing to learn from that is that people who have been raised by authoritarian parents in an authoritarian culture hugely overestimate their own ability to disobey an immoral command. People think they will. And, in books and movies, it's always the underdog who goes against the establishment, rah, rah, rah for him, and people cheer for that, and they think they are that, and they're not. And the Milgram experiments show that what they actually are is people who will inflict evil on their neighbor if a perceived authority tells them to. And the Milgram experiments showed that in a humongous way, where not only normal people, but like experts in psychology and psychiatry said, oh, only a few people are going to actually get to the point of really hurting a stranger because an authority figure told them to. And in reality, it was about 2/3 of those tested did things that that they thought were inflicting severe pain or even death on an innocent stranger just because a perceived authority figure told them to. And so it shows that what authoritarian parenting leads to is a society that's just waiting for a tyrannical empire to come along and do evil crap. And that all comes from how kids are raised. Because if you raise kids to respect themselves and respect each other and understand that they own themselves, you don't treat them like an underling, you don't treat them like a serf, then you cannot trick them into falling for tyranny. Someone comes along and says, let me rule you. They say, no. I mean, I'll listen to your ideas if you have suggestions and stuff, but you don't get to rule me. Nobody gets to rule me because that's not what I am. I'm not somebody's underling. I own myself. And so, and that gets, a lot of people miss the significance of how much parenting matters to that sort of thing. And again, Stefan Molyneux has a million podcasts about this that go into detail that are really good, showing that. So, but in the next one, in the next rant, since that's about all the time I have for this one, um, I will go into the Milgram experiments more and how they relate to parenting. And eventually I'll get to the the actual question, because the main reason people ask me to bring it up is they are parents or about to be parents, and they're like, well, how do you, like, other than just letting your kid do whatever the heck he wants, between that and being a tyrant bossing them around, how do you actually raise a kid to be a thinking, self-owning individual? Because, that you won't find that in many parenting handbooks. Parenting handbooks, this is changing, but parenting handbooks for the most part are about the same as how to train your dog, like how to make your kid be what you want them to be, which is a really creepy starting point. If you're, if you actually want to raise a human being, don't think that you're supposed to train them to be one. Think that you're supposed to help them to become what they are supposed to be, which is a self-owning, moral, thinking human being. Howdy, Larken Rose here. Time for another daily rant. Going to pick up where I left off last time, talking about anti-authoritarian parenting. I want to start by, eventually I'll get to the question people are actually asking, which is, well, if you're anti-authoritarian, if you're an anarchist and raising kids, what do? Do you just let them do whatever they want? And if not, aren't you being an authority? And so that's the real question, and I will get to that in a bit. But I need to first talk a little bit about the Milgram experiments. Now, people familiar with my books and stuff probably heard this before. I highly suggest people get the whole version of the story by reading Obedience to Authority, the book by Dr. Stanley Milgram about the experiments he did. Now, because I've mentioned these before, I'll be quick about my description of it. In short, it was a test to see to what degree normal people would inflict harm on a complete stranger just because a perceived authority told them to. So the way this experiment works is they run an ad telling people, we need people to do this experiment having to do with human memory, because you can't tell the people, we want to see how easily you hurt a stranger if authority tells you to, because then they'll know, and that'll totally skew the results. So instead, it was advertised as a study on human memory, where you come in and there's one guy in a chair, he's tied in a chair and has electrodes attached to him, and another guy in front of a zapper machine. And the guy in the chair is asked memory questions. When he gets one wrong, the guy at the zapper machine is supposed to set a voltage on the zapper machine and zap the guy. And they're pretending that the purpose of the experiment is to see if punishing people for not remembering something makes them remember things better. Which sounds sort of silly, but that wasn't really the experiment anyway. In reality, the guy in the chair was an actor. He was pretending to be electrocuted and zapped. And the one actually being studied was the guy in front of the zapper machine. Now, each time he gets a question wrong, you have to flip another switch, which increases the voltage. And it goes all the way up to 450 volts. And at every step along the way, the actor in the chair is supposed to do different things when he gets zapped. And up to 150 volts, he just sort of lets out grunts. But at 150, that's when he first says, I don't want to do this anymore. I want out of this experiment. So up until then, he's there willingly and voluntarily. So almost everybody makes it to 150 volts because, well, the guy agreed to it, and he's doing it by choice, and he isn't saying, stop, let me out, until 150 volts when he says, yeah, I'm done. And when Milgram was coming up with this experiment, he explained it to like psychologists and psychiatrists. Most people said, first of all, most of the experts said hardly anybody is going to go to the end. Only total sociopaths will go all the way to the end. And because by the end, the actor is like screaming bloody murder, like he's in pain, and then eventually feigning unconsciousness or death. He goes dead quiet, pun intended, all the way at the end, or very near the end. And so they, Milgram tried to make this experiment so, okay, hardly anybody will stop right away, hardly anybody will make it to the end, so we'll have a nice, bell curve of statistics in between. And when he described it to psychologists and stuff ahead of time, they said, yeah, hardly anybody's going to make it to the end. Well, to jump right to the punchline, 60-some% of Americans made it all the way to the end, which means they would keep pressing a button that they thought was inflicting very painful shocks, if not life-threatening. And at one point, the actor complains of heart problems, and on the machine, it actually is marked danger beyond a certain point. And with all these warning signs to not do it, most people, a healthy or unhealthy majority, went all the way to the end to 450 volts. And Milgram was pretty dang shocked by the results of the experiment. This was done back in the was it 50s or 60s, and in part it was driven by the question, how the heck could the Nazis do what they did? Well, we got the perfect answer, because they were trained to believe in authority, just like Americans are trained to believe in authority, as demonstrated by Milgram's experiments that show that the average American will inflict horrible pain or death on a complete stranger who wasn't even accused of doing anything wrong, just because an authority figure told them to. And it's important to point out, the authority figure in that case was a scientist in a lab coat, and he wasn't threatening the zapper. He wasn't saying, if you don't zap him, you're going to get zapped. Nor was he saying, if you do zap him, you get a huge pile of money. So it was just the impression of someone being an authority, and to what extent will that make people obey? And Milgram found out, wow, tons of people obey to just a horribly scary degree in inflicting harm on their fellow man. And there were some interesting things to note about the experiment. Again, if you read Obedience to Authority, you can see all the different variations he did on the experiment, and some of the interviews they did afterwards, because they would interview the people afterwards and say, okay, by the way, here's what we were actually studying. Now that you already did it, we couldn't tell you this ahead of time because it would bias the results, but here's what we were studying. And the things people said during the test and the things people said afterwards were just fascinating. And one of the important things to note is most of the people doing it, you could see they were uncomfortable, and they would tremble, and they would shake, and they would be really nervous, and they would look away, and they'd be, obviously in mental discomfort, and sometimes would cry, and often would ask to be allowed to stop. Do we have to continue? He's like screaming, and in most cases, all the authority figure had to do was say the experiment must go on, and most people would go on. Now, a couple of people asked, who's responsible? If he gets hurt, who's responsible? And the authority figure would say, I am. And then everybody would keep going. Oh, well, you're responsible. I'm the one here electrocuting him, but I'm going to keep electrocuting him if some authority says it was their doing. And wow, why do you think Nazi Germany happened? That's why. Because people believe in authority, and they accept no personal responsibility for their actions. Yes, I'm talking to you, law enforcers. If they're just carrying out orders from a perceived authority. And so, again, the topic of this rant and the last rant is anti-authoritarian parenting. So why do I bring up the Milgram experiments? Because this is the result of authoritarian parenting, is you create a society of people who will do evil crap if an authority figure tells them to, because their parents raise them to respect authority, and raise them to think that obedience is a virtue, and raise them to think that doing as you're told means you're a good person, and disobeying means you're bad. And they learn that in school too. Over and over again, you're rewarded for doing as you're told and going along and obeying authority. And in school and with most parents, you quickly learn that there are two classes of people. There are the subjects and there's authority. In a classroom, it's not equal. The kids don't have an equal say. They have to be where they're told to be and do what they're told to do and speak only when they're told to speak by the authority figure. So it's years and years of training to do as you're told. And you get rewarded if you do as you're told. And if you disobey, you get punished. You get good grades and approval every time you obey authority. So it's training somebody to be an obedient subject. And training people like dogs works. You know, you train a dog, oh, you pooped on the rug, I'm going to hit you on the nose with this rolled up newspaper. Yes, you can kind of train people that way. However, it doesn't actually build good human beings, and you set up a system where you're just waiting to have violent authoritarian fascism. Because if I did the picnic analogy last time, if someone is just trained to behave properly, and this is a thing that parents just, I don't know why it doesn't occur to them. When parents do the authoritarian thing of saying, you know, I'm going to teach you how to behave and I'm going to punish you when you don't. If you smoke, I'm going to punish you. And if you fool around with your girlfriend or boyfriend, I'm going to punish you. And if you drink, I'm going to punish you. And if you do this, I'm going to punish you. And it's all focused around training them like a dog. Like, I'm going to hit you when you do things I don't want you to do. But I don't know why it doesn't occur to parents. What happens when they aren't there anymore? When they leave the house, you're not there to hurt them. And if the only reason you ever gave them to not do those things was that you're going to hurt them, as soon as you're not there, that disincentive is gone. Now they're somewhere else thinking, well, why shouldn't I smoke? My parents aren't here to hurt me anymore. You didn't give them another reason. And so authoritarian parenting doesn't actually give anybody a good reason not to do those things other than you'll get hurt if you do them. Well, now they won't because they're not under your control anymore. So, first of all, authoritarian parenting fails to actually accomplish what it tries to accomplish by, you know, just reward and punishment, train someone like a dog or program them like a robot. Second of all, it makes them into a Nazi waiting to happen. Because as Milgram's experiments show, if you have a whole culture that believes that, and, you know, you can look at the culture of Germany before Nazi Germany, you can look at the culture of Russia for the Soviet Union, the culture of China, which is very authoritarian, and so much pack mentality in Asian cultures that, you know, in China the name goes the other way around. You say the clan name, the family name first, and then the individual name. So you identify first with the group you're in before the individual. And then you add on top of that authoritarianism, and then when somebody like Mao comes along and everybody thinks of him as authority, then they all do stupid, violent stuff, and they go along with it because they've been raised to respect their elders and do as they're told, as if that's a virtue. And it's, you know, it may be a little bit less in the U.S., but not enough less, as the Milgram experiments show. So, that's why not to teach your kids authoritarianism. But now to get to the actual question of, well, how do you know, if you're an anarchist with kids, how do you raise them without being an authority? And you know, tons of people ask, aren't you just kind of automatically the authority if you're parents, you know, and telling them what to do and controlling their lives? And there's a million little individual questions that you could ask about, what do you do about this? What do you do about that? To me, it really boils down to sort of the overall thinking in your head when you're parenting, and which then comes out in the overall message that your child receives. If in your head you're thinking of your kid as a robot in need of programming, as your property, and you get to decide what he's going to be, and you have to make him into that, you're already doomed. Because you're already not going to raise a human being. If you think of him as his own person, he's already as much, he or she, is already as much of a person as you are. Now, they might not know anything. They might not be able to do anything. You know, a baby can't do anything. It doesn't know anything yet. So you have to take care of them. But they're already people. They're already just as much people as you are. And they own themselves. And it isn't your job to decide who they're going to be. They get to decide who they're going to be because they own themselves. Now, It's good if you can show them by example how to be a decent moral human being who respects others and the rights of others and all that. But the way to have them actually be good is not hit them when they do things you don't like. It's to demonstrate how to do things they should do, how to behave in a way they should behave, so that they actually see it and accept it and make it part of themselves rather than having it just be training. So, first of all, not only does authoritarian parenting not teach actual goodness, it just teaches obedience. It actually teaches the exact opposite of goodness. Because if you're trying to teach your kids don't hit people. Oh, and one reason I haven't talked about this very often is because Stefan Molyneux has 8 million podcasts about it that I think are really good. But if you're teaching your kid don't hit people, hey, you hit that kid, I'm going to hit you over and over again. Like, that's not really teaching them don't hit people. It's teaching authority is allowed to hit people and other people aren't. And trying to teach them don't dominate over others while dominating them sends mixed messages, obviously. So you get the thing of you authoritarian parents and siblings, and like elder siblings want to be the authority of the younger ones. And I had 4 older brothers who were raised conservative authoritarian, and some of them decided that they should be authority over me. And it was never like horrible abuse or physical torture or anything like that. But it's just sort of the natural way that children mimic what they see. And if they see, oh, there's a hierarchy here of who's in charge, and I'm certainly not at the top of the totem pole, but hey, somebody's beneath me, I get to boss them around. And children just learn that. And then the goal is not to be a decent human being interacting with others on a voluntary basis. It's how high can I get up the totem pole so there's more people under my control and less people to control me. And that is not a good agenda for a human being to have. And teaching authoritarianism teaches them that. It doesn't teach them goodness. You can't teach someone peaceful coexistence by hitting them. I don't know why that would require any elaboration. You can't teach peaceful coexistence to someone by hitting them. And so the details of how somebody raises their kid, like, some parents will say, if Johnny's old enough that he says, I want to eat that whole box of chocolates. Some parents will say, well, you don't get to. It's my choice. They're my chocolates, and it's my job to look out for your health, and you're not going to be happy in, a few hours when you have a stomach ache and you're throwing up. So, no, I'm not going to let you. And other parents say, well, I'm going to let him. I'm going to tell him ahead of time, here's what's going to happen, and you're really not going to like it. It'll be fun while you're scarfing him down, and then your stomach will hurt, and you'll feel sick, and you might throw up, and you'll be unhealthy. And so some parents will say, well, if the kid is a certain age, I'm just going to let you, and you'll learn the lesson. Some say, no, I still think it's my responsibility to stop that. To me, what matters is not the individual choices of what you do in this or that situation, because, every parent can look back and go, oh, I wish I did that a little bit differently, and I wish I did that a little bit differently. To me, what matters is totally how you see your children. Like, do you see them as human beings who own their own lives? Like, are you there to help them grow into the person they're supposed to be, or are you there to make them into whoever you think they're supposed to be? And if it's the latter, it's going to be a disaster. First of all, it's going to fail. Second of all, you're going to make them into a twisted, confused human being who may find their way out of it. And it's been awesome to see how many kids who were raised authoritarian end up being advocates of peaceful coexistence. I was raised authoritarian. I wasn't like beaten or tortured or, it was just sort of your standard run-of-the-mill authoritarian upbringing. And now, of course, I'm an anarchist and don't believe in authority at all. And Tess and I have our daughter, who's now 17, who is raised by anarchists her whole life. And we joke about the fact of, what are you going to rebel against if your parents don't make any rules? And it's not quite that we don't make any rules, but there's a natural rebelliousness and wanting to be independent that teenagers go through, but it doesn't have to be like this horrible battle, like, because the parents are like, I have to keep controlling you, and that's why there's a battle. It's like, you're hanging on to a wild dog while it tries to get away because you so much think, I have to not let you be what you're trying to be, instead of letting go and then letting them know, here are the reasons that you're going to want to make these choices for your own benefit, not because I commanded you, not because authority said so, but because bad things happen to you if you don't. And of course, you don't get to choose genetics, and there's a huge, it's not like every kid is the same blank slate to begin with, and it's just environment. So I can't say, well, our upbringing is why our daughter is way more sort of socially adept and responsible and stuff than I am, and way more socially adept than either of us, Tessa and I, were when we were going to school. The whole being shy and that routine. She's way ahead of us in that. And I don't know how much of that is genetic and how much is upbringing and how much is what she just decided. But the whole time we acknowledge she's herself. She owns herself. And our goal is to sort of be in charge of taking care of her until she can totally claim ownership of herself, which has worked pretty dang well. And so, yeah, to me, the main thing is just the underlying attitude and the message you convey to them. Because if the message the child gets, if you're bossing them around and saying, you have to do this and you're not allowed to do that, and I disapprove of you and you're bad because I caught you smoking, now I hate you and I'm going to ground you and punish you, completely aside from whatever the issue is, like smoking. Yeah, smoking's not good for you. But completely aside from that, you're basically conveying to them that you don't think they own themselves and that you think you're the boss of them, that you get to decide what is done with their body, for example. Because you get to tell me what to smoke, whether to smoke or not. Why? Why am I your property? And that's a thing to rebel against. If somebody else thinks I'm their property, I don't want to be their property. Which is, a lot of times the teenage rebellion thing is a good sign because they're trying to be human. They're trying to be self-owning things. And if you're trying to be a controlling authoritarian, they're going to fight back against that. And then it makes a big disaster in every direction. Whereas if they get the message that you actually care about them and you understand they own themselves and you try to guide them and give them advice, and, as soon as you can explain a reason for why we don't want to do it this way and you want to do it that way, and then let them choose, the sooner you can do that, the better. And so I really think the overall view is way more important than whatever particular choice you make in any particular situation or setting, because what children mimic what they see. And if they see you treating them and everybody else as human beings deserving of freedom and respect, that's how they're going to tend to treat other people. And that's how they're going to see themselves of, cool, I own myself. And they'll be way more confident than if they just think they're slaves. So I'm going to close this rant. There's more to say about that, so I'll probably keep going with this subject in the next rant. But let me end this with the very last thing for my book, The Most Dangerous Superstition, which you can get at Amazon.com or LarkenRose.com, because it very much ties into it. It's sort of the punchline of the whole book. Now, there's lots more to it, but here's the very ending. If you love death and destruction, oppression and suffering, injustice and violence, repression and torture, helplessness and despair, perpetual conflict and bloodshed, then teach your children to respect authority and teach them that obedience is a virtue. If, on the other hand, you value peaceful coexistence, compassion and cooperation, freedom and justice, then teach your children the principles of self-ownership. Teach them to respect the rights of every human being, and teach them to recognize and reject the belief in authority for what it is. the most irrational, self-contradictory, anti-human, evil, destructive, and dangerous superstition the world has ever known. Obviously, that doesn't exactly match normal parenting, but if you want to see the result of normal parenting, open a newspaper and read about wars and oppressions and police abuse and all the lovely things that happen when you train people to obey authority. And then you might start to see that, yeah, maybe the way we've been doing things forever is not the way to do things. Maybe we have to start treating children like they're actually people. Yeah, they start out as incompetent people, but they're already people. They're not dogs. They're not robots. They're human beings and should be treated like human beings.